This is Drive Live with Natalie Lindo-Taylor and Tim Elliott.
It's Drive Live at 6:21. Simon Marks joins us on the line from Washington, D.C. Compliments of the season to you, sir.
And the compliments of the season to you, Tim. I think this is our last outing of the year because fate would suggest that Christmas Day and New Year's Day are both on a Monday.
I think they are. The heavens have conspired against us.
Picking it up in 2018.
I'm just wondering who you're going to be outing, but there you are. We'll see what happens in this phone call, I think. Let's start with President Trump, set to make a major speech, Simon, on national security, set to brand China and Russia as competitors with the USA. So no change there then.
Well, absolutely. I mean, they're calling this a doctrine. Suddenly, according to Trump administration officials, he's got a foreign policy and national security doctrine, and he's very excited about it, and he's going to be laying it out in a speech here in a few hours' time. The centerpiece of the doctrine, you will not be surprised to learn, given that he has clung to his Make America Great Again mantra since he first started running for office, is America First. There will be those, of course, who point out once again that America First has some rather unfortunate historic echoes going back to World War II when there was a movement called America First that formalized the argument that the United States should stay out of World War II and be isolationist. It was Europe's problem, nothing to do with us here in the United States. Ultimately, of course, the America First ideology lost out to the view of Franklin Delano Roosevelt that the United States had to get in and save Europe from the Nazi scourge. But Donald Trump's version of America First will argue that the United States will always put its own national interests first, but that does not necessarily translate into a policy of America alone. In other words, he's going to argue that while he has spent much of this year untangling the United States from international agreements like the Paris Climate Change Accord, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that's not the bedrock of his international viewpoint. He's going to argue that the United States essentially is in a never-ending competition for power and influence with other countries on the world stage, including Russia and China. And I think it's going to be very interesting to listen to the language that he uses about Moscow and Beijing for a couple of different reasons. I mean, we all know that the president's language on Russia has often seemed strangely beguiled by the personality of Vladimir Putin, something that everybody here is still trying to understand and investigators are digging into. But also it's going to be interesting to see if there's a contrast between the way in which Donald Trump talks about China in this speech on U.S. soil versus the way in which he talked about China when he was in China just a few weeks ago, where he seemed somewhat deferential to the leadership of President Xi Jinping. So the Trump doctrine will be unveiled here in a few hours' time.
And Simon, I guess in sort of almost comparison to that, Putin has phoned Trump to thank him for the CIA helping them foil a terror attack in St. Petersburg. So almost an example of the two countries not being in competition, but working together. Is it a miracle?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a fascinating issue, isn't it? I mean, and that broke over the weekend. We now know that President Trump and Vladimir Putin spoke on the telephone 4 times over the last few days. The final conversation from Vladimir Putin thanking President Trump for CIA assistance in what the Russians claim was a planned terror attack on Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg and a variety of other locations in St. Petersburg. And Vladimir Putin expressed his personal thanks to the head of the CIA and also told Donald Trump that Russian intelligence will now provide information to the U.S. about threats to America from international terrorist organizations and interests. So that does suggest that there are occasions when the United States and Russia can enjoy a more productive relationship than they've traditionally enjoyed, and when the intelligence agencies of those two countries, and remember, the intelligence agencies here, unlike Donald Trump, argue that Russia did interfere in last year's presidential election and was trying to swing the outcome of that election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And yet, clearly on this particular issue, when lives were apparently going to be at risk in St. Petersburg, those two intelligence agencies, Russian and American, found a way of working together. So very interesting timing, given that President Trump's going to speak in this national security speech about Russia being a strategic competitor of the United States. Interesting, too, that he still rejects the idea that the Russians were trying to interfere in last year's American election.
It is very interesting timing. Further evidence of the president's hostility towards the Mueller inquiry, Simon, but no plans to fire the special prosecutor, as far as we know.
Well, that's what he says. This after a weekend in which the most dangerous place in Washington was between Republican supporters of President Trump and open microphones, because it's clear that the White House encouraged the president's supporters to fan out and tell interviewers all over the city that Robert Mueller is doing a disgraceful job. It needs to wrap up as soon as possible. This investigation into ties between the Trump campaign and the Russians last year is a distraction. And as President Trump maintains, there was no collusion with Russia. The problem for Donald Trump is that there's no indication that Robert Mueller's wheels are grinding any slower. No indication, really, that the investigation is reaching its conclusion. Rather, ongoing indications that it's broadening in its scope, looking at whether there was an attempt to obstruct justice by the President of the United States when he fired James Comey, the FBI director, looking at the behavior of the president's own son-in-law, Jared Kushner. So the president says, I'm not going to fire Robert Mueller. He knows that doing so would set off a firestorm here in Washington. Senator Lindsey Graham, a senior Republican on Capitol Hill, has said, if you fire Robert Mueller, that will be the beginning of the end of your presidency. And yet, the Trump team is very anxious for this inquiry to wrap up. So we continue here to wonder just how much more latitude Robert Mueller is in fact going to be given by the President of the United States to keep digging and keep finding things before the President of the United States loses his patience, loses his temper, and says, right, we've got to shut this thing down.
And just finally, chaos, but not in the political sphere. A massive power cut yesterday in Atlanta. I remember seeing this on the news. And people are saying, look, it's just chaos. 250,000 flights, is it a day? Or 250,000 passengers they have there. So one of the world's biggest airports was closed down essentially for a few hours.
Absolutely astonishing, Natalie, and especially given that it's the holiday season here and people are beginning to travel. It was a very busy travel weekend. There was a fire, apparently, in an electricity substation that served Atlanta Hartsfield International Airport and completely cut power to the airport. And if you were following this story on social media over the weekend, there were painful testimonies from aircraft passengers who in some cases were stuck on the tarmac waiting either for clearance to take off or clearance to bring the plane into a jetway so they could get off the plane for up to 6 hours. A sign, frankly, of America's ongoing infrastructural challenges. It's hard to imagine that, one electricity substation and a fire in it can bring one of the nation's busiest airports to its knees. Real questions there about the security of America's national infrastructure, but certainly horrific experiences for passengers. In some cases, they've been on, international flights for 12, 13 hours, landed at Atlanta Airport, and then spent another 6 hours sitting on the plane before they could get off and leave the airport. So as a frequent traveler myself, I can only feel for them.
Simon Marks, based in Washington, D.C., thank you for all your contributions in 2017. I'm hoping, as a frequent flyer, we're going to be able to provide you with a seat in this studio at some point next year.
Well, I'm hoping that too. As you know, Tim, I've passed through Dubai on several occasions this year, and I'm going to be doing the same again next year. And I think one of these days I'll have to leave the airport.
All the best for 2017. Thanks, Simon.
Same to you guys. Have a very happy holiday season.
It's 6:30.